Eating every.
We good now? Okay, cool. Like I said, I'm glad to be back up here again. I would like to go ahead and apologize just quickly. If I speak fast, that's my bad. When I get nervous, I do that. So just a little heads up. But hopefully by tonight, we all get some out of this. So as you can see on the screen, the title of my lesson tonight is What Does Charlie Brown, a Pilot, and a Future King have in common? And no, Odie, not that Charlie Brown. I'm sorry. Our story starts on December 20th, 1943. Charlie Brown is the pilot of a B-17 bomber called the Ye Old Pub. The mission for them is to bomb the aircraft production facility in Bremen, Germany. And this is also happens to be the first mission that this crew participates in. This is a very important mission because the facility produces the FW-190 fighter, one of Germany's most pristine and excellent fighters during the war. Bremen is heavily defended by hundreds of fighters and hundreds of flak guns, or anti-aircraft guns. In the sky, flak damages 2 of the engines of Charlie's bombers. Now, American bombers, when they fly, what they do is they get into a box formation. And what this allows them to do is have as much defensive capabilities as possible from enemy fighters. What this also means, though, is that if you get damaged, they leave you behind. Think of it like lions hunting a pack of zebras. They go for the weak and injured ones first. So if they get left behind, they get picked off. They're easy prey. And unfortunately, this is what happens to Charlie and his crew. They fall behind and they are mercilessly attacked for around 10 minutes by German fighters. And many of the crew are injured. Now, one of the second characters in the story is Franz Stiegler, which is up there. He is a German fighter pilot, and he had always been enamored by aviation ever since he was a little kid. Around 12 or 13, he began flying gliders that he made in his backyard. During the war, he flew around 487 combat missions, while also shooting down 28 aircraft and having been shot down himself 17 times. He was awarded the German Cross in Gold for his acts of bravery. I remember reading a story about him one time, and he had shot down an Allied fighter pilot, but to make sure that he was safe, he flew around the area that he crash landed in, and he waited to make sure a farmer picked him up to hide him away. He also has the very interesting distinction of flying one of the first operational fighter jets in history, which you can see up at the top. That's the Me-262. Now, right before Franz spots Charlie's bomber, his bomber goes into a very steep nosedive. Now, luckily, Charlie is able to pull the bomber out of the dive, but he loses much of his altitude, which leaves him very exposed to enemy aircraft fire and enemy fighters. Now, Franz has already landed. His plane is being rearmed and refueled, and he's ready to go back out again. So once Charlie's bomber flies overhead, he quickly gets in his plane and takes off to catch up after him. Once in the sky, Franz quickly catches up to Charlie and his bomber. And as he flies closer to the bomber, he can see through the holes that have been created due to the anti-aircraft gun that the crew is cowering in fear in the corners, trying just to desperately survive. And Franz can't make himself shoot down the plane. So he flies a little bit closer to the cockpit and begins giving hand signals to Charlie. And basically what these hand signals were was trying to get him to fly to Sweden. Sweden during World War II was a neutral country. And so what they could do was they could land in Sweden and live out the rest of the war in peace. Unfortunately for Charlie, he did not understand what these signals were. So he kept flying back to Britain and trying to make it back to the base. Now, Franz understood what he was doing, so he escorted the bomber out of German airspace so the fighters and the anti-aircraft guns wouldn't attack them no more. Once they reached open water, Franz once again tried to get them to turn to Sweden. But Charlie was fed up because he didn't understand what was going on and he wanted him gone. So he ordered one of his gunners to turn the gun to face Franz. Franz, understanding what this meant, he saluted them and flew back to his base. Luckily, Charlie managed to land the bomber back at the air base, and all but one of the crew members survived. Unfortunately for Charlie, in the debriefing, he was told to never tell this story to anybody. The higher-ups didn't want the new airmen to get the idea that maybe the Germans would spare them in the same way that they had spared Charlie and his crew. Charlie and friends continued to fight throughout World War II and completing a full combat duty as well. It wasn't until 1984 when Charlie finally went public with this story. He was at a veterans conference, and he went up to speak about his experiences when he finally told the story. And in 1986, he began the search for Franz all over the world. But it wasn't until 1990, over the phone, when they finally spoke for the first time. Franz had been living out his life in Canada after the war. And on the phone, Franz detailed his experiences and what he saw, and Charlie knew right then and there it was him. The two became best of friends, and they went all over the world telling their story until their deaths in 2008. So, you may be thinking to yourself, well, Taylor, that's a great story. It's nice, but this isn't the History Channel. This is church. What does this have to do with anything? Well, I'd like to point to David and Saul. And right before we get to chapter 24, I'd like to turn to chapter 18 so we can set up some context. So here's the context for this story. Saul is the first king of Israel. Now, in the beginning when Israel was created, God was going to be the king. He was going to be the ruler of it. But the people didn't want that. They wanted a king. So God anointed Saul as the first king. And he did great things for Israel. He did all of these great battles and such. And then David comes along and he defeats Goliath. And he continues to fight under Saul and do all these amazing things. And because of this, David has risen in popularity and he is known everywhere. You know, and in verse 7 we get Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And Saul becomes fearful of this and jealous at the same time. But as of right now, the relationship is still steady. It's okay. Then, things continue, and Saul offers his daughter to David in marriage. He just has to complete some trials, things like that. It's okay. And then in the beginning of chapter 19, Saul tells Jonathan and his servants that he should kill David. And in verse 1, it says, Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, My father, Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and will tell you what I find out. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath, As surely as the Lord liveth, David will not be put to death. So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. So basically, David hides, Jonathan speaks to Saul on behalf of David, and everything's all lovey-dovey now. Everything's okay. It's back together. That is, until a little bit later. And it says in verse 8 that once more war broke out, and David went on and fought the Philistines. And he struck them with such force that they fled before him. So here he goes again. He's going and fighting again. He's getting more fame. He's doing more great things under Saul. But once again, Saul is getting jealous of this fame. And it says in verse 9, But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul, as he was sitting in his house with the spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him, as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. And in verse 11, it says that Saul had sent men to David's house to wait for him and kill him. But David's wife, thankfully, told him about this plot and helped him escape, and she set up a little dummy in his bed and all this stuff. So he's gone, and he has fled, and he's gone to Ramah. He's far away from Saul as he can. So now we finally get to the meat and potatoes of this story, which is chapter 24. So if you will turn with me there. So, in the very beginning, we learn that Saul has returned from fighting the Philistines. And as he comes back, he's told that David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So what Saul does is he takes 3,000 men that he has chosen, and they go there to try and find Saul. Now, as they continue to look, Saul has to relieve himself. He has to use the bathroom. And there's a cave that he goes to. Unbeknownst to Saul, farther in the back of the cave, David and his men are there waiting for him. And it says in verse 4, the men of David said, "This is the day that the Lord spoke of when he said, 'To you I will give your enemy into your hands, for you to deal with as you wish.' Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe." Now, that may seem like an innocent kind of thing to do compared to killing him. But to David, he was immediately racked with guilt because of it. And this was because Saul was still the anointed of God. Even though Saul tried to do awful things to David before, it was still God's anointed. And more importantly, he was David's master. So then we see in verse 6, he says to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord." And with these words, David sharply rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. So he let Saul escape, and then we see in verse 8 that David follows behind him. And starting in verse 8 it says, "Then David went out of the cave and said out to Saul, 'My lord the king.' When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, 'Why do you listen when men say, David is bent on harming you? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because he is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate that I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me. But my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Who are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand." And so basically, just in summary, what David is saying is, listen, I could have killed you. I had an opportunity to, but because you are my master and because the Lord anointed you as king, I cannot do it, even though I had a great opportunity to. And when David finishes, Saul looks around and he realizes who is speaking, and he cries aloud. Then in 17 it says, "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not kill off my descendants, or wipe out my name from my father's family." So David gave his oath to Saul, and Saul returned home. But David and his men went up to the stronghold. So again, just in summary, Saul's apologizing, but also thanking him at the same time for not killing him, and just asking him to not kill off his descendants or destroy his name. So, hopefully you understand why I have told both of these stories at the same time. Even though they happen centuries apart, they're still incredibly similar when you look at them, when you just sit down and compare the two of them. But now I want to go back to the very beginning and to the very first slide, where the title was, "What does Charlie Brown, a pilot, and a future king have in common?" Now that may not make much sense before we started, but hopefully it makes a little more sense now. But it's love. That's what they all have in common. It's love for their fellow man. Friends felt compassionate for the men aboard the bomber, even though they were destroying the country that he swore to protect. Charlie Brown loved Franz enough to try and find him decades after the war, even though they were supposed to be bitter enemies. David loved Saul enough to spare his life, even though Saul had tried to take his multiple times. And as Christians, as we look around the world, is it really any different? I mean, since the dawn of our arrival, we have been shunned and hated from Rome to the Middle East and everywhere in between. Even in this great nation, we find ourselves on the defensive more than we would like to admit. We may not find ourselves fighting in a war or running for our lives from a king, but we may experience an attack from a person or people who do not like who we are, what we do, what we say, what we stand for. But the question is, can we stand strong and love our fellow man, like David, like Charlie, or Franz? Can we forgive them for the things that they do or they say to us? So, as I close tonight, I want to remind you that there is someone who has forgiven you. And he died for you so that you could be forgiven. And that's Jesus, the literal Son of God, who came down to save us from the sins that we commit. He did it because he loves us. He loved me and you. He loved the thief hanging on the cross beside him. He loved the people that chanted crucify as he was hung. And he can forgive you too. No matter what it is, he can forgive it. You just have to accept it. So maybe tonight you haven't been baptized and you would like to do so having recognized that Jesus is the Son of God and he came down this earth to save us from our sins. Or maybe you have done something and you need to be forgiven of it. Or maybe you just need the prayers and support of the church. Whatever it may be, please come as we stand and sing.